Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to Hilaal Live. This is the second part of the show. We say Jazakallah to you, the viewer, for staying with us. We hope you had a wonderful Eid. I also like to say Jazakallah to my co-host Luqman Shadrack for taking you through that first hour. Now let's start off with one of the big stories making headlines this week. The Pretoria High Court declared Home Affairs Minister Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi's decision to discontinue the Zimbabwean Exemption Permits unconstitutional and invalid. 2 years ago, Motsoaledi announced the special permit, which was first introduced more than a decade ago, would be terminated. Now, to discuss this, I'd like to welcome James Chapman. He is the head of advocacy at Scalabrini, who is also a advocacy group. Mr. Chapman, thank you so much for joining us, and good evening.
Good evening to you, and good evening to your viewers. It's very exciting to be here.
Apologies for the tongue twister there. First question: what were, in the opinions of Scalabrini, the decisions taken by the High Court in declaring the decision to discontinue the ZEP unconstitutional?
Well, I mean, it's not surprising to us at the Scalabrini Centre of Cape Town to hear that the High Court found that the decisions made were unconstitutional and invalid, unlawful, on the basis that they violated PAJA. They didn't act in accordance with our administrative law, and that there was a failure on the part of the minister to actually adequately follow, simple due process in making his decision to discontinue Zimbabwean exemption permits. So while he ought to have engaged with critical stakeholders, particularly with those who were impacted, whose rights were being compromised by the decision, there was no engagement required in terms of our administrative law, but rather there was merely the making of the decision without consultation or fair process.
Yeah, you speak a lot about consultations, and this is the next question that comes in, because surely there had to be some consultations from Home Affairs with, of course, advocacy groups like the one you represent, like the Helen Suzman Foundation, and so many others.
You would think so, but in practice there was no engagement with the Consortium for Refugees and Migrants in South Africa, for example, the other applicant in the case with Helen Suzman, with the Scalabrini Centre, but also, I think really importantly, there wasn't any engagement with Zimbabwean exemption permit holders themselves, in excess of 178,000 people whose livelihoods, were under threat of being completely uprooted, being removed from the country after almost sort of 15 years in the country. And they were not even so much as, spoken to, consulted, discussed, and the impact on them was not in any way heard. Their voices weren't heard.
Mr. Chapman, Dr. Motsoaledi said to challenge the ruling. Of course, he would do that because it's in his prerogative to go ahead and appeal this. But are there any concerns with regards to this? Because if you are, of course, a Zimbabwean holding this permit, or a Zimbabwean here, wanting to work and wanting to make an impact in South Africa, you would be concerned with this, won't you?
Well, I mean, you're quite right that the minister is well within his rights to appeal, should he or his legal advisors have advised him that it's advisable to do so. What is positive is that there is still a direction in place to provide for Zimbabwean exemption permits to the end of 2023. And we would argue or suggest that in event of appeal, that the order remains in place in effect pending the outcome of the appeal. So we would make I would anticipate that the Helen Suzman Foundation and the Consortium for Refugees and Migrants South Africa would make an application to ensure that the order was in place pending the outcome of the appeal. I'm not sure that the prospects of the minister's success are particularly high, But what's important is that you have the dignity and the protection provided by the temporary relief set out by the High Court in place and remaining there until the 28th of June 2024 at the very least. Whereas if the matter is appealed and as sometimes is the case pending appeal, the order doesn't remain in force, then the protection and the dignity providing provision of the High Court order then would be compromised, making the situation of Zimbabwean exemption permits holders that much worse, with only a sort of 6-month period in which they can lawfully remain.
What are the conversations like with advocacy groups like the one, of course, you represent, in order to bring assurance to the Zimbabwean permit holders? Because, following on from that question, there is uncertainty. So how do you bring that assurance knowing that this could be a 50-50 likely scenario of is it going their way or it probably not going their way?
So, I think the one major assurance is that the law is on their side. It is clear in terms of administrative law that if you're going to make a decision that has such a far-reaching impact on the lives, livelihoods, rights of a particular community, that you have to follow a fair process. The fact that a fair process wasn't followed, the High Court has found was unlawful, unconstitutional, and invalid, and the same will be found, I have no doubt, at a higher court. The second assurance is that there is still something in place at least until the end of the year. The third assurance is that there are, in a number of instances, waivers and visas being granted to ZEP holders, giving them recourse perhaps beyond the space of Zimbabwean exemption permits. So there is some assurance, but the most important, I suppose, is to say that we are here in solidarity. There are a number of civil society organizations, in particular, I'd point out the COMSA, Consortium for Refugees and Migrants South Africa, as well as Helen Suzman Foundation, who will continue to fight and argue for the rights and the protections of this particular community and to ensure that the law is done and seen to be done.
One final question, Mr. Chapman. For now, of course, the Zimbabweans who hold this permit can still continue their work. But going ahead with regards to the future, what now? Because, again, that word uncertainty will always be there.
So what next? If the minister, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier in the week and in other media engagements. If the minister were to come to the table and were to reconsider the decision to effectively follow a fair process, then I think that leaves the door open to a proper and frank discussion as to where we are with potentially SADC visas, like a low-skilled work visas, or a continuation of a similar regime to the ZEP, or some kind of mechanism, putting something in place, ideally something more durable and long-lasting for Zimbabwean exemption permit holders. However, with the indications and the press release from the department indicating that they intend to appeal the decision and to argue against it, there doesn't seem to be space in the short term for engagement and a better kind of solution to be reached. It still remains to be seen as the matter is appealed, where things will develop from there. But my sincere hope is that the Department of Home Affairs, and particularly the minister, will be open to a proper, fair, and dignity-respecting dialogue on a suitable way forward for Zimbabwean exemption permit holders.
Mr. James Chapman, we say thank you so much for joining us here on Hilaal TV.
Thank you, and thank you to your listeners.
That's Mr. James Chapman. He's the head of advocacy at Scalabrini Centre. again, the uncertainty with regards to those holding these Zimbabwean extension permits and what the future is. Dr. Motsoaledi will, of course, be appealing this as it is his prerogative, but what then for them going forward, and how will the courts rule should this appeal be taken to them? After the break, I will be catching up with Andile Lungisa. We're looking ahead to the ANC Youth League conference taking place this weekend. It's already started today, and of course, a former Youth League a leader like himself, of course, he served as the deputy president. We're going to getting his take whether the Youth League can return to its heydays, or is it just one part of the ANC that wields little or no power. Do stay tuned.